Hey church, Pastor Shane here with another community group discussion starter video. This week we're in week 2 of our Allegiance series about being allegiant to Christ and Him alone, which means giving Him our complete devotion, our complete loyalty, and our complete commitment to Christ as King. We talked last week how there's a lot of things kind of pulling on our allegiance to Christ, a lot of things that would distract us, a lot of things that are asking for us to be allegiant to it rather than our Savior, and that if we could remember to keep Christ first, then kind of everything else falls into place. We want to remember that as we interact with the world, especially in certain areas. One of those areas that we're talking a lot about this season, of course, is in our country's election season, where things just seem really intense. So we kind of continued on in the idea of allegiance this week, but talked about the fact that if we are allegiant to Christ as King, then we need to be allegiant to what He is doing in the world. What is His mission? What is He trying to accomplish at this time? And so we kind of laid out God's plan, the Missio Dei, the mission of God, which was to redeem a people to Himself. We walked through creation, the fall of humanity, which is human sin, and that human sin is the cause for many of the problems that we have in our world today. That God chose to pursue us and sent Jesus Christ to redeem us from those sins, that we might have the forgiveness of sins through His death on the cross and resurrection from the dead when we trust in Him, and that one day He's going to make all things new. But right now we live in this kind of in-between time where Christ has come, He is changing lives, He is, as people trust in Him, their sins are being forgiven, and they're becoming back into right relationship with God the Father, but that also we're not there at the time when Christ has fixed everything yet. And so we're called to kind of participate in God building His kingdom, to participate in the good news, the gospel, as Jesus continues to work in it and through it to change people's lives. And that ultimately Jesus is the solution to our sin problem. And if the problem of human suffering and the problems we see in our world is sin, and Jesus came to take care of that sin problem, then that's the only thing that's really going to change our world today, at least the main idea of it. So, we also talked about the fact that there are some kind of false ideologies being offered, these things that would lead us away from God, things of kind of solving some of the problems in our world today. And we talked about some of the political realities of that just because of the season we're in. Things like the idea of socialism and how that hopes to help make things more equal, to solve the problem of human sin by kind of redistributing wealth and kind of redistributing the product of one's labor. That ultimately it is humans who are running for that, and it does not solve for the problem of human sin and corruption, which is why it has always ended in tragedy. We talked about what I called empire, and I'm going to play with that term a little bit more in the future. This idea of, hey, if we just get the right people in charge, then we can kind of fix all these issues. We talked about Christian nationalism, and I know that term is overblown, but the reality of blending one's allegiance to Christ and one's allegiance to a nation could get kind of fuzzy, that it is Christ first, and then again, as someone who loves their country, and then their country, and that those two should not be blended together, that we see ourselves as part of an eternal kingdom first, and how kind of trying to blend those two together, trying to see the Christian and try to create this kind of Christian identity among our politics isn't necessarily going to solve the problem of human sin either. Even as we live in a country we'd like to see reflect the values that God has built into creation and the values that we hold as those following Jesus Christ. And we talked about identity, this fact that you can't just boil someone down to a couple of their characteristics, and that is ultimately dehumanizing and ultimately not helpful to them. That there's kind of racial identity politics, this idea of kind of really emphasizing someone's immutable characteristics, and that should be kind of how they identify, and that ends up kind of dividing the races. That ends up pitting the races against each other, which is not what Christ called for. He called for racial reconciliation, that through Jesus, the races and the tribalism of the humanity spirit would kind of be brought back together and reunited. We talked about the idea of sex and gender identity politics, which is similar, that for desire to help those who are really hurting by affirming some either gender dysphoria or some kind of other sexual desire isn't necessarily helping that person. It's kind of denying who God has created them and to be, and that someone's identity shouldn't be wrapped up just in their gender and sexuality, and that this kind of movement to kind of affirm and kind of build that out into our society is, I think, a movement that started with kindness, wanting to kind of help people in need, but ultimately denies them their humanity and denies God's design for humanity as well. And so it doesn't end up solving the problem of human sinfulness. And so we see all these ideologies fail to do that. And so my encouragement to the people this week is to kind of remember that and to be focused on participating in the gospel, in sharing our faith, in building up other people's faith, and in growing in our own faith and holiness and obedience to God. And if we could put that first and understand that's primarily how God is working in the world today, then we actually get to take part in changing our world. I mean, sometimes we get it the other way around. We want to kind of change our society or culture or government and then hope that the human hearts are changed. But that's not how Christianity is designed. As we see Jesus working in the world and the early church working in the world, the desire there, the plan of God that was being worked out was to change human hearts, was to save people by the power of the gospel, to transform their lives. And that helped shape cultures and societies and governments. Now, I know that I've left people a lot of questions, because the question then is, well, should we be able to participate in our society at all? Should we just be focusing on the gospel? And I think there's a lot more to talk about that. And so we're really going to cover that in week 4. I just want to make sure people know that, because people are kind of like, well, you get there already. But I want to make sure we're building a solid foundation so we can talk about, yes, there's ways for us to participate in our culture, in our society, in our government that is completely appropriate for the Christian and that represents God well. But we could only do that if we are recognizing God's ultimate plan and if we are taking part in God's ultimate plan. So you're going to kind of walk through what God's plan is. You're going to walk through what those false ideologies are. I got some questions for you on that. They're big topics. These are topics we've covered more in depth other times. I wouldn't get stuck in any individual one, but I think it is important to kind of consider these things that are being offered as kind of other ideologies apart from Christ as the solution for human sin. And then kind of talk about your gospel participation. How are you participating? Is there a way you need to get more involved in what God is doing here or around the world, whether it comes to sharing the gospel, whether it means pouring into someone else's life? I mean, I think it's kind of, you are kind of preaching to the choir here. You're the community groups. You're obviously already doing some of this, but it's good to ask oneself, how am I contributing to what God is doing? How am I offering myself up for God to use me as He works out His gospel plan, as He changes people's lives by the power of His Spirit through what Jesus Christ has done? I think you're going to have a great discussion this week. These are a lot of good questions. Leaders, kind of keep account of your time as you walk through this. And next week, we're going to be talking about kind of the fear that comes with seeing some of the challenges in our world today. And then the following week, we'll get into, okay, now that we built a good foundation of allegiance to Jesus Christ, how should we be involved in our world today? Hope you have a great discussion.